Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum.
Hoosier fans, it's Indiana basketball time. IU Basketball Mini-Series tickets are now available in 6-game or 3-game ticket packages, as well as individual games. This is your chance to check out the Hoosiers inside beautiful Simon Scott Assembly Hall. For more information, call or text 812-855-4006 or visit IUHoosiers.com. Go IU.
On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, Alex Bozich and I are joined by our old friend Zach Osterman from the Indianapolis Star to talk all things IU basketball. We take a look at the beginning of Romeo Langford's career and whether he has kind of been what Zach expected or more than Zach expected. We talk about Devante Greene and what he needs to do to be able to have more of a consistent positive impact for Indiana. We also discuss Archie Miller and what differences Zach has noticed in him now in his second go-around as Indiana's coach. We talk recruiting. We look around the Big Ten. It is a wide-ranging conversation featuring lots of great insight from Zach, as you would expect. So we hope you enjoy this episode. Before we get to that discussion, a quick word from this week's sponsor, Home Field. At homefieldapparel.com, you will find the comfiest and most unique licensed IU apparel that is available anywhere. Home Field was started by an IU grad, and all apparel is designed and printed out of Indianapolis. And this holiday season, you can find the perfect gift for the IU fan in your life with premium IU apparel from Home Field. If I might offer a recommendation, and this is from firsthand experience, check out the Tri-Blend Fleece hoodie. I particularly like the one with the old IU Bison logo. I get lots of questions about it because it's not a logo that a lot of people are aware of, but I've always really liked that logo. And even more than that, this sweatshirt is so comfortable. It is so soft, so comfortable. I wear it much more than any 37-year-old man should be wearing a hoodie during the week, but I just love it. So anyway, that is a definite item to consider. And they have a bunch of other items, too, that feature some of these vintage designs from IU's storied history. So that's one of the things that makes Home Field really unique. But go there to their website. Remember that the cutoff for guaranteed Christmas delivery is December 19th. So make sure that you get your order in before then. And, of course, don't forget to use the promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, at checkout so that you get 15% off of your first order. The website, homefieldapparel.com. So promo code BRINK, website, homefieldapparel.com. Home Field, wear one for the team. And now, here's our conversation with Zach Osterman. And ladies and gentlemen, joining us this week on Podcast on the Brink, he is the IU beat reporter for the Indianapolis Star, the host of Mind Your Banners, and the head of Midwest PR for Publix Supermarkets. He is Zach Osterman. Zach, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink, man. Always great to have you here.
Thanks. It's been too long. Probably being held off because of my controversial Publix opinions.
Well, we are not here to talk about supermarkets. We are, of course, here to talk about IU basketball. And so I figured let's just start with kind of a big picture question about where Indiana is right now. 10 games in, Indiana's 8-2. They've got the one horrific road loss at Duke, balanced out by the 4 top 50 KenPom wins, a 2-0 start in conference play. As you kind of look at the way this season has started, how do you think Indiana fans should feel about this beginning to Archie Miller's second season?
Probably like this. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to speak for either of y'all. This sort of feels like what I expected par to be for Indiana at this point in the season. And especially as we saw the injuries kind of pile up there over the first, few weeks. This was a young team. This was always going to be a talented team. This was a team that Archie Miller clearly wanted to be a deep team, a team that went 9 or 10 players deep at times. That was what he said in the preseason. And it was, in my mind, it was always a team that was destined to be very different in February than it was in November or December. And that's not me guaranteeing that every problem that this team has will be fixed by then. And they've certainly got some. I'm not claiming that they're, flawless by any means, but to kind of pull through all of that, the injuries, the youth, how much maybe Indiana's had to rely on some guys that probably didn't at least outwardly expect to have to rely on as so heavily, thinking about Rob Finney, Al Durham to an extent, DeMacy Anderson in stretches, probably even frankly Deron Davis, given, how much time he missed during some critical sort of offseason conditioning portions of the year. I think Indiana should feel really good to be where it is. To be 8-2, yeah, the Duke loss is tough, but it's worth pointing out that Indiana loses by, I think, 16 fewer points at Duke than Kentucky lost to Duke on a neutral floor in front of a pretty pro-Kentucky crowd. And I'm not saying that, Indiana's better than Kentucky. That's not really what I'm saying, so much as there are other talented teams out there that Duke has been even, frankly, rougher on than Indiana. And so that, yes, that was a disappointing performance. I don't doubt that, but you can kind of take that in isolation when you consider, as you said, the four top 50 wins, the fact that they are literally just sort of gravity, doing something different with either Rob Finney's layup or Deron Davis's tip in away from winning at Arkansas. That wasn't even necessarily kind of one of those performances that you'd look at and say, well, it was a narrow miss, but they didn't really deserve to win. I mean, I thought they deserved to win just as much as Arkansas did. They just got a bad break. And I'm guessing if you, for all of the flaws of that specific performance, if you handed it to Archie Miller again and said, it'll be tied and you'll have 2 looks at the rim with 5 seconds left, he'd say, yeah, I'll take that. In that scenario, that portion of the season, that environment against that team, I'll take that, every day of the week. And so I think obviously we're probably going to get a little bit further context with the game against Butler on Saturday. I still don't quite know what to make of Butler, but I know that the numbers and the computers like them. And I think that there's always kind of been a difficulty for Indiana in playing Butler in Indianapolis, maybe Butler getting to feel very much like sort of a cornered underdog, if you will. But personally, I think Indiana should feel really good about where it is to this point in the season, with obviously some things to work on, but already having overcome a lot of challenges and started to maybe prove to itself that it can win the kind of close, tight games that it seems like we're going to see this team in a lot this season.
Zach, I'm sure you've gotten some of the same tweets and different responses, emails from fans the last couple of weeks. There seems to be, and I don't want to call it a majority by any means, because I don't necessarily think that fans who say things on social media are indicative of kind of the pulse of the fan base, but there seems to be some frustration just overall with the turnovers. And, I think to an extent the free throw shooting is an issue as well. But of those two issues, which do you see as more problematic in the long term, and which do you see as being more fixable as the season goes along?
I guess I'd probably be a little bit more concerned about the free throw shooting. And I don't know if I would have said that a couple of weeks ago, but I think it's worth pointing out that Indiana's last 4 games, we've seen a marked sort of, downturn or whatever you want to say. I mean, Indiana's last 4 games, their turnover percentages have been 17.8. 16.2, 15.6, and 13.4. So Indiana's, even in that Duke game, Indiana has been over the last 4 games performing at a substantially better level in terms of holding onto the ball than it was over maybe the first part of the season. It's also worth pointing out that that turnover percentage is I think the lowest, or those 4 of the 5 lowest in the season. So one way or the other, it seems like the turnovers are becoming a little bit less of an issue, I guess is my point. Whereas with the free throws, I would be more concerned just because it seems like as much as we're getting a good sample size for the way that some guys can shoot free throws. I mean, Romeo Langford shot 71. Juwan Morgan's already shot 29. Justin Smith shot 34. We're seeing guys get a lot of free throws, and you would feel like if those guys were meant to shoot better from the free throw line than they are, we would have sort of seen some of that attenuate by now and kind of come back to the mean. And some of it, I mean, Romeo Langford, I think there's a perception that he's really struggled from the line, and I don't think he's shot necessarily the percentage that he can, but he's still shooting 69%. So he's not that far away. He's one or two good free throw shooting performances away from being up in the 70s, and everybody's like, well, that's a pretty good number. And I think you still do also have some guys like an Al Durham or a Devante Greene that you can look at if you need a free throw in a tight situation. Who takes a technical foul free throw late in a road game? Who do you want to get the ball in their hands last 30 seconds trying to close out a 4-point lead, that kind of thing. I think you still have something to rely on there. But it does seem generally like the turnovers have come down a little bit, or at least have been able to be controlled a little bit more. Whereas I just think that, again, as many one-possession games as it seems like, not just Indiana's played, obviously they've won these last 3 games by a combined 5 points, but you start to look at, Ken Pom projections for the Big Ten season, you start to just look at those individual teams. I'm staring at their schedule right now, 3-point underdog at Maryland, 3-point favorite at home against Nebraska, 5-point underdog at Purdue, 1-point underdog at Northwestern, 2-point underdog at home against Michigan. And this is all before 5-point favorite at Rutgers. This is all before January's out. Like we're talking about the possibility of Indiana playing a lot of really close games in the Big Ten. Indiana has proven it's a team that can foul, that can draw fouls and get to the free throw line. But I would be worried that maybe water isn't finding its level there, I guess you'd say, in terms of a team that's going to need to win some close games this year, being able to make the free throw line work for it.
I wanted to offer one quick correction, Zach. The turnover numbers were definitely better against Louisville, where it was 14.9%. Penn State was 22.9%. Northwestern was 19.1%, and Duke was 25.3%.
So was I looking at? I think you may be looking at
defensive turnover numbers. But I mean, they are trending better, obviously, with the Louisville game. And I think they were better. Or the Penn State game was when they were worse in the second half. They had that bad stretch for about the first 10 minutes. But hopefully we see the trend that what we saw against Louisville becomes a trend, and it'll definitely be important against Butler, a team that doesn't turn it over very much and does force turnovers. That's going to be something Indiana's going to really have to pay attention to. Romeo Langford coming into this season, obviously his presence was one of the biggest storylines. Where, in your most recent stock watch, you talked a lot about he and Rob Finney and what they've done as freshmen. Has Romeo been what you expected, more than you expected, less than you expected in any areas? How would you assess the beginning of his freshman year?
I mean, I think he's been, frankly, exactly what Indiana would have hoped for. I mean, he's a fairly efficient player. Obviously, I'm guessing he'd like to be shooting a little bit better than 24% from behind the 3-point line, but he's getting fouled a ton. He's finishing on twos really well. He's got a good mid-range and step-back game, which is something that you maybe don't let a lot of players do, but the ones that have it, the ones that are that good, you let them go with it, because that's just something that not a lot of college players often have to defend, and so it can kind of really throw them off in terms of how to handle a player that could pull up from 15 feet, how to handle a player that can step back from 17 feet, something like that. I think he's been a good rebounder, which is important. He's not turning the ball over, which is important. And more than anything else, he has been really comfortable playing like Romeo Langford. And when I say that, I mean everything that would every connotation that carries in terms of what people expected: a 3,000 point scorer, a Mr. Basketball. I would say Indy Star Mr. Basketball. Sorry, just because we write it that way in our stories. But a Mr. Basketball, a McDonald's All-American. He has looked comfortable doing that all the time. I mean, when you think about the Marquette game and Indiana just needs somebody, he's the one that's sort of pushing his foot down on the gas pedal in the first half of that game. He's the one that carries Indiana through some tough stretches against Arkansas. And I know they lose, but he still carries them through some tough stretches. He's the one that closes out Northwestern. You could say he does something similar to the Arkansas game at Penn State. He scores 21 points against Louisville. And again, is kind of Indiana's go-to when not a lot else is working consistently on offense. And I think that the key for Indiana has always been this year that with Romeo Langford, they could let him do that and not have to demand he do much more. They have other players that can defend. I think he's actually been a better defender than probably I would have expected at this point, but they have other players that can take tough defensive matchups off his hands. They've got other players that can be more floor leaders. They've got other players who, generally speaking, can kind of take away just the little burdens so that all Romeo Langford has to do is just kind of be himself and set the standard by, his undeniable skill level. And I think he's actually getting better. That's the other thing. It's not like he was just kind of dropped in and from day one, he's kind of been the same player. I actually think he's getting better at both ends of the floor. And I think that as Indiana gets deeper and maybe he doesn't necessarily have to play, we saw him playing 38, 39 minutes at various points early in the year. I think he's still going to play a lot of minutes. But, you look at a game like Louisville, he only plays 31 minutes, but he's got 21 points. He hits 9 free throws, 4 assists. And so I think that as you get deeper into the year, you're going to maybe see even more from him. And I think he's been, like I said, just kind of what I would expect. He looks like not just one of the best freshmen in the Big Ten, but one of the best players in the Big Ten.
Hey, let's take a quick minute here and talk about tickets. Getting tickets online can be far too complicated. There are hundreds of sites and varying levels of reliability, and that makes it hard to know who to trust. But that's why SeatGeek is the way to go. SeatGeek pulls millions of tickets into one place so that you can easily find the seats that you want for a price that you're willing to pay. And as we all know, there is nothing quite like being there in person, and SeatGeek will get you closer to the action for a great value. I've heard so many people talk about how loud the atmosphere was for the Louisville game, how great that was. Imagine being there in person later this season for the Michigan game, for the Michigan State game, for the Purdue game. There's going to be so many big battles during Big Ten play at Simon Skjodt Assembly Hall and at all the many road venues in the Big Ten. If you're close to one of those venues, go check out these Hoosiers in person. See Romeo Langford play during his one go-around as a Hoosier. See Juwan Morgan play during his final go-around as a Hoosier. And when you do that, SeatGeek is the place to go because they search multiple ticket sites and then they grade every ticket based on value. So when you open up the page, you can basically just immediately identify the best seat that fits your budget because of this unique grading system that they have. And this is really important, every purchase is fully guaranteed, so you can shop for tickets on SeatGeek with confidence, and if anything happens, they will take care of it. I know that because we've had many people who are listeners to this show, listeners to the Assembly Call, that have had, an issue, and SeatGeek always takes care of it to their satisfaction. That's why it's fully guaranteed and why you can feel comfortable trusting SeatGeek. It's why I have it on my phone, why I use it for concerts, for sports tickets, for any type of live event. It's the first place I go. So what you should do right now is download the SeatGeek app and enter the promo code BRINK today, BRINK, and you will get $10 off your first SeatGeek purchase. That's promo code BRINK, BRINK, for $10 off your first SeatGeek purchase. SeatGeek, life's an event. We have the tickets. Now back to Zach Osterman.
Zach, how big of an adjustment do you think it's been for Indiana's role players, complimentary guys, playing with Romeo? It seems like at times there have been situations maybe where, somebody could have looked for Romeo or maybe he had an opening and somebody didn't necessarily do the best job of getting him the ball. Do you think there's still kind of an adjustment period going on with some of these guys learning to play with a guy who really sometimes you just want to throw him the ball and say, go make a play?
Sorry, that's me trying to close my office door so you don't hear my dogs barking. I think probably, and I think that's especially, you got to remember with a young team, Rob Phinisee, I think, is a willing point guard and distributor of the ball for others. But it's also worth pointing out what Rob Phinisee just naturally has had to be the last couple of years at McCutcheon, which is not just a point guard, but also a scoring guard, a lead guard, just a star player. I think that's often an adjustment for freshmen at a lot of levels. And also it's an adjustment too. I know these guys will work out in the offseason, but it's different once you start to actually get into game action and you're having to deal with the way that an opponent adjusts and then the way that your coach adjusts to their adjustments and the chess match that goes on there. I again, I think maybe part of the reason that I would say Romeo Langford is getting better is that his teammates are also getting better at really understanding his kind of strengths and preferences and how he can finish, and how well he can, sort of take what he does well and what allows him to succeed the most, I guess. So yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely been true. And I'm not, again, it's not something where I'm saying, Indiana's just sort of, they've checked that box. Everything is fixed there. But I do think it's probably one where you're just seeing a greater level of comfort overall. And a lot of that's going to be with the player who's using the greatest percentage, if I'm not mistaken, of possessions on your team. When you're talking about comfort level, it's never going to be more important than with how everybody supports the star player or players. But it's again, maybe a reminder that Indiana didn't drop, this wasn't like Cody Zeller or even Eric Gordon, where Indiana dropped a star freshman into a team of juniors and seniors. Indiana dropped a star freshman into a team with, one senior starter, one senior reserve player who maybe at some point could start again. A couple of juniors that so far basically have, both been kind of dealing with different injury issues and playing off of the bench, and then a bunch of freshmen and sophomores. And so it's another part of kind of maybe talking about how this team is probably going to look pretty different, just in terms of the eye test. And certainly if you were to compare some performances side by side come February, as opposed to November, especially if it can stay healthy.
Well, on last week's show, one of the key points, and I don't want to call it debate, but topics we discussed was Justin Smith, and that was coming off of his performance at Penn State. And then I thought against Louisville, he maybe had his best overall game of the season, just in terms of, his defense. Obviously, Jordan Wara had a really good game, but I thought for the most part, Justin Smith did some good things defensively, obviously had 9 rebounds. But, our discussion last week was kind of centered around this hypothesis that if Indiana is going to reach its potential as a team, Justin Smith has to continue to kind of go up a level. And, there was a lot of folks that I heard from, in the previous couple of weeks when he wasn't playing as well, saying, why isn't he playing more? And my kind of answer to that was, the coaching staff knows that if this team is going to end up being as good as it can possibly be, that Justin Smith has to be a big part of that. How much do you subscribe to that, that Indiana does need him to kind of reach his potential? And what have you seen maybe out of him the last 2 games that was different from the previous stretch where he wasn't playing very well?
I think the rebounding has always felt like something that got Justin Smith going. And you hear coaches talk about it being sometimes different things that if a player's not playing well, with Victor Oladipo, sometimes it felt like if he wasn't playing well, challenge him defensively. And that just seemed to kind of spark him to life. It just kind of depends on a different player. A good 3-point shooter maybe just needs to see that's maybe one of the most common ones. A good 3-point shooter just needs to see 1 or 2 of them come out of his hands feeling good and go down, and all of a sudden he's got that rhythm and that confidence. For me, it did seem, and this is anecdotal, and I'm not going to sit here and study it all together, but it seemed like Justin Smith was really good last year when he was engaged on the boards and when he was either pulling in key defensive rebounds and I think this was something he got better at as last season went on, grabbing offensive rebounds and getting easy baskets that way. And I think, look, he's undoubtedly had some tough games. I mean, Arkansas was probably a low point. Duke, it's kind of hard to single out anybody with Duke, just because it's not like there was anybody that walked out of that gym thinking, oh my God, what a game I just had. But for me, it's always felt like when Justin Smith is engaged on the boards, and maybe defensively as well. But I actually think that there have been some performances that statistically for him didn't look great this season. But actually, if you look at what he did defensively, against a Lamar Stevens, so a little bit of his work in the Marquette game, I think there's actually been some times when maybe it's gone a little bit unnoticed how much defensive sort of responsibility Indiana's placed on Justin Smith this season. But I think that if you can he's just a guy that it feels sometimes like his energy levels come up when you kind of challenge him or when you can get him going somewhere else away from his offense, if that makes any sense. And then some of that can feed directly into the offense. Again, a cheap offensive rebound leads to 2 free points, and all of a sudden you're on your way. You get a putback dunk or whatever. And maybe some of it's just confidence too. I think he's been trying to do some of the things that, for example, when he goes up for that huge dunk against Louisville, I think he'd been trying to do stuff like that over the first few games of the season, and he just hadn't been able to. And so again, maybe it's just a factor too of seeing it work once or twice, and all of a sudden you've got that confidence and that assertiveness. And it's maybe important to remember too, on a young team, he is just a sophomore, and he's a sophomore who didn't start a ton last season. He's kind of in and out of the starting lineup at different points. Did play a lot of minutes toward the end of the year. Played 25 minutes against Nebraska, 37 minutes in the loss at Ohio State. But he's still he's a younger player than maybe some people remember. And so I think that it feels to me anyway, sort of anecdotally, like the trick is getting Justin Smith going with something other than the scoring, other than just the offense, and let that be something that feeds his offensive game and seems to get him maybe just a little bit more energetic. And when you can get him really energetic, all of a sudden that athleticism, takes on a whole new level of importance.
Speaking of getting a guy going, let's talk about Devante Greene, who has dealt with some injury issues this year. Coming into the season, a lot of people thought maybe he could break out. Lots expected of him, potentially being Indiana's point guard. He doesn't have that pressure now because Rob Phinisee has clearly taken that spot. But he still has an important role as a backup ball handler on this team that doesn't have a lot of ball handlers. And I don't want to overreact to his numbers too much because he's been injured, hasn't played a lot of minutes. But his offensive efficiency, for the second straight year, is down. And I'm curious what you think his role is on this team moving forward and how important it is that he get to a point where he's playing more consistent basketball than he is right now. Because we've seen a few flashes. He was great at the start of the Penn State game, but then in the second half we saw a return to some of the old bad habits that we had hoped as a junior he would be out of, but yet they linger.
Yeah, he's just got to turn the ball over less. And I know that's hardly breaking new ground, but you look at turnover rate is at a career high. It's even higher against Tier A and B opponents. It's even higher than that against Tier A opponents only. And I'm sure that at some level, some of it's just that he's been hurt rhythm-wise by the fact that not just that he's injured, but Rob Phinisee and Al Durham have both been so good in his stead. Durham has shot the ball well. Phinisee obviously has had some big moments, both as a point guard and then just as a player. When you think of some of the 3-pointers that he's gotten to fall against a Penn State, against I think it was a 3-pointer against Penn State. That was the road game that I missed. But the couple of the huge threes he hit against Louisville. And so all of a sudden it's also just, to your point, Devante Greene no longer has that pressure of needing to be Indiana's point guard. But I guess as a counter to that, I would argue that sometimes it really felt like he was thriving under some of that pressure last season, that he actually got better when he got handed more of that responsibility. If you'll remember the way that he played over the last kind of month and a half of the season, as he rose into that starting point guard role, it felt like that was when we saw the best of Devante Greene. And maybe he was a player who kind of thrived with that responsibility, who thrived on that stage. And again, I think some of it is undoubtedly going to be the fact that it's important to remember he's only played 4 games. He played 2 games, then he missed 4 games. He's only been back for 4 games, and those 4 games have been Duke, Northwestern, Penn State, and Louisville. So it's not like he's even had, maybe a couple of gimme opponents to just sort of stretch his legs, open things up, and really get that confidence and that rhythm going in a low stress environment. But a point guard just can't be turning the ball over on almost 33% of possessions at the same time. And so I think that as much as anything is going to be where, to me, he gets some of that playing time back. His assist rate isn't that bad. His assist rate is 23.2%. It's 31.4% against Tier A opponents. So he's creating really well against good teams, but he's also turning the ball over way too much against good teams. And I don't know if some of that can be gotten back just with rhythm and more playing time and more minutes. I don't know how much of it is something that maybe is just, in year 3, maybe we're still just talking about a player who's going to struggle with turnovers. I think that's something that only time will tell. But from Indiana's perspective, he's going to have to fight to get some of those minutes back because, again, with Romeo Langford doing everything he's doing and Al Durham and Robert Finney playing well behind him, it's not like Indiana's got this pressing need to suddenly just hand Devante Greene 31 minutes a night.
And the thing with Devonte, too, in his defense, we focus a lot with the offense, and the turnovers are such obvious mistakes. They really draw people's ire. He's been better defensively this year. Even with the injuries, he's generating more turnovers, getting more steals. I feel like he's been more solid. And so it is worth pointing out that on, one entire half of the court, he's been better. It's just the offense that I think everybody is hoping will come around. I want to ask you about Archie Miller. Have you noticed anything different about him, kind of seeing him up close after games? And does he feel at all more comfortable now in his second year? Any difference between what you saw from him last year and his first go-around?
Not a ton. And it kind of goes to – I wrote a story right at the end of last season just sort of talking to people who'd seen Archie's first couple of years at Dayton and what it looked like and what he looked like through kind of the process of building Dayton into what he wanted it to be as a team and as a program. And one of the things that really stuck with everyone I talked to was that he didn't change much, that he was never – that it was rare to find him particularly upset about bad results. It was rare to find him particularly over eager about good results, that he just kind of had this, it was the same mentality and the same approach all the time. And that a big part of what served him well in those early years at Dayton was that he was just kind of who he was consistently all the time. And his consistency slowly, but kind of steadily was transposed onto his program. And then you look at kind of what he did at Dayton over his last 4 years there, and you see, and I'm not saying that this is exactly what's going to happen this year, but you see a lot of what maybe we've seen early in this season, which is his teams won a lot of close games. They won a lot of games along the margins. They won a lot of games where it just felt like sort of the winning plays and maybe even the lucky breaks always broke their way. But then you say, well, it's that old cliche about, do you make your own luck? I don't think there's a ton that has really changed about him to me. I mean, I think he seems certainly a little more comfortable. I think that's natural. I think he seems a little bit more, I don't know if at ease is the right term, but a year later, he probably feels a little bit more like this is his program. These are his players. When he's talking about things like expectation, it seems a little bit more natural for him now because he's the one who has been setting it for this roster for so long. And he said something interesting in his coach's show this week when they asked him about Indiana was ranked. They were in I don't know if I've ever seen this, a bizarre three-way tie for 25th in the AP poll this week. And I think Don Fisher asked him about it on his radio show, and he said something to the effect of, I used to not care about rankings. And Dave Jablonski, who's my counterpart at the Dayton Daily News, actually tweeted Archie's quote at me and maybe a couple other people when Archie was ranked or asked about rankings at Dayton. And he sort of said, I don't really like rankings. I don't care about rankings. All that matters is your ranking in March. And I feel like every time we get ranked here at Dayton, we fall out of the ranking. We lose not long after we fall out of the rankings because they're just a distraction. I think Don Fisher asked him, not necessarily about that quote, but just about how it felt to be ranked. And Archie said, I used to be a guy that just hated the rankings. And it was just not an interesting thing for me. But he says, since I've been at Indiana, I've kind of come to understand what the expectation and the level of expectation is around a place like this. And to me, it's actually important to really kind of not embrace being ranked 25th, obviously, but to appreciate what it means to see the number next to your team's name, basically, and to understand that that's the standard, and that, being a top 25 team, improving on that, potentially being ranked even higher than that at some point in his tenure, obviously, that's the expectation in Indiana, and rankings shouldn't be considered a distraction. They should be considered, I guess, in some ways, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but almost a a marker that you lay down at a place like Indiana to say, no, this is what we, this is what we do. This is what's expected around here. And so I think there's maybe a little bit more of that he's comfortable demanding more of his players and his program a season on. But that's, again, I think also just something that's natural for a second-year coach as opposed to a first-year coach. So I think that personality-wise, he's a lot of the same of maybe what he was a year ago. But I think there are maybe some natural evolutions, I guess you'd say, to the way that it seems like he has kind of settled into the job, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I want to ask you about one more guy on this year's team, Juwan Morgan, who, we talked earlier about the kind of pressure and expectations Romeo Langford had coming into the season. And Juwan, after a season last year when so much was expected of him and he had so much on his shoulders, we knew that would be the case again for him. And he's been so much better in so many areas. Obviously, the two glaring areas where he hasn't been are free throws and untimely fouls. And a couple of times when he's gotten, those untimely fouls early, it's really hurt Indiana. But overall, a terrific start to the year for him. What have been the biggest changes, either positive or negative, to his game that you've seen so far this year?
Well, I think that I don't know if this is a change. There is something about Jajuan Morgan that's really stuck out to me. And I mean, he's, if you look at the numbers, he's rebounding well. He's finishing twos somehow remarkably better than he did last year when he shot 63% from the floor from 2-pointers. He's shooting threes better than he did last year. He's shooting almost 43%. He's probably as good around the rim as he's been at any point in terms of defending the rim and shot blocking and rim protection as he's been in his career. He's handing the ball out, and I'm literally just staring at his stats. But the thing that kind of jumped out at me with Juwan Morgan almost from the start of this season is how comfortable he is not being the sort of lone star on this team. And what I mean by that is last season, there were so many nights when it was like, if Indiana can't play through Juwan Morgan and get a big night out of Juwan Morgan, and we're talking 22, 23, 25 points plus, at least 8 or 9 rebounds, maybe even 15, Indiana has no chance, because there's so little else that Indiana can rely on to really kind of build as its foundation offensively. This season, there are other places Indiana can go for its offense. Romeo Langford is an obvious one, but again, you think about the way Al Durham has been shooting threes. You think about the glimpses we've seen from Evan Fitzner. You think about these last couple games from Rob Finney. There's obviously the potential in, somebody like Devante Greene or Deron Davis to come off the bench and have a really good game. And especially early on, I mean, in his first 4 games, Juwan Morgan scores 9, 14, and 13 points. He's only got 1 double-double in those 3. You just sort of feel like he's for a guy who has undeniable talent, who put up great numbers last season, who's a senior that is obviously really committed to making this season matter and making this season count. It's remarkable to me the degree to which he looks comfortable just sort of being fading in as part of the furniture when that's what Indiana needs. When Indiana doesn't need him to be 24 points and 11 rebounds, Juwan Morgan, but is perfectly content as it was against Marquette with him being 13 points and 8 rebounds, Juwan Morgan, which is still a good game. It's not necessarily a game that you would expect from a player that I think I thought probably at least had sort of dark horse Big Ten Player of the Year credentials, certainly first team all Big Ten level talent this season. But it's that 13-8 against a team like Marquette, that's a good game. That's a good game. I think there are players in Juwan Morgan's position who would probably think that's not a good game and not in a selfish way, but in a way that said, I'm a senior, I'm a captain, I'm this team's returning second team all Big Ten forward. So much is expected of me. I need to be contributing more. My stat line needs to be stronger because I'm not doing enough for this team. Now, the problem has been, as you point out, when he's gotten in foul trouble, and that's been a concern. Arkansas, I don't want to say Indiana loses the Arkansas game just because of Juwan Morgan, because there are a half dozen reasons or more. But Indiana probably has a lot better shot at winning that game if Juwan Morgan doesn't miss virtually the entire first half with foul trouble, especially when you consider how well he plays in the second half. but the ability that he's had to just sort of adapt seamlessly into a team that suddenly has more options, that maybe doesn't have to rely on him as often as it did a year ago, or at least as much as it did a year ago, and still seem like he's keeping the same edge, the same leadership ability, the same ability to communicate and demand more from his teammates and all that kind of stuff. I think that honestly, it speaks to his maturity and probably his leadership, that he can be a guy that, UC Davis game comes around, he scores 31 points because Indiana needs him to that night. 31 points and 10 rebounds because Indiana has nothing else working, and it needs Juwan Morgan to just flex his muscles and be more dominant than any other player on the court can possibly handle. But he can also be a player that steps back and is okay with somebody else taking the lead, is okay with somebody else being the one that really sets the terms offensively if that's what's needed and that's what makes sense and that's what works. That's a mature approach from a senior who undoubtedly probably has placed some pretty high expectations on himself this season. And I think it's something that's been really impressive to me. Sorry, I know that was a monologue. I apologize.
That was great. Thank you.
Zach, switching gears for a second, since you're an AP voter, there was a bit of a controversy this week, and I'm not trying to obviously start in a media war of any kind. Don't take it that way at all. But Graham Couch, who's a columnist in Lansing, did something this week, I think, that maybe ruffled some feathers with some fan bases when he left Duke, Kansas, Tennessee, and I think a couple other schools out of his AP poll because they hadn't played a road game to this point of the season. Just as an AP voter, does that bother you that he did that? And kind of what's your opinion on, judging teams this early in the season when, they haven't necessarily all played equitable schedules, I guess is what I'm trying to ask, because it doesn't seem like it's as easy to judge a team. Obviously we know Duke and Kansas and Tennessee are worthy of being in the rankings, but obviously not all schedules are created equal. And so I'm just kind of curious your general thoughts as a voter on what was done with that particular ballot, and then also kind of how you evaluate teams this early in the season when conference play hasn't begun and teams are, 10 wins for one team and 7 for another are obviously not equal in a lot of cases.
Yeah. I mean, it is, there is no perfect science to it. I think that's the first thing you have to say. And I think Graham, in fairness to Graham, I don't think this is a grandstanding thing. I don't think this is an attention-seeking thing. This is something he's always done with his ballot. Not necessarily this, but my point is he's always sort of used his ballot to at least in his own sort of, his own parish, hold teams to a certain standard. Like I said, I don't think I've ever gone quite that far. But, for example, I dropped Kansas State and Kentucky out of my ballot, and I had both of them, I want to say top 15, and they both lost a couple of games this last week. They both still, I think, are good teams that long-term have every chance of rounding into conference championship contenders, getting back into the top 25, having perfectly fine seasons. But I dropped them because ultimately they've had chances to beat teams that you would say, hey, that's a nice win, and they haven't done it. Kansas State is probably not as celebrated of a case, or I don't know if celebrated is the word, but highlighted of a case. Kentucky is a good example, though. Yes, they played Duke on the first night of the season, and that's commendable, whether you do it at home or on the road or on the moon. I don't care, but they lost that game. They went and played Seton Hall in New York City, but they lost that game. And so you got a team whose best win is UNC Greensboro at home, whose second best win is Southern Illinois at home. And those are above average mid-major teams this year, without a doubt. But at the same time, you can only get so much credit for it. At a certain point in the season, in my mind, I've got to start picking teams that have put results on paper, because my ballot, I always kind of see it as a mixture of what I see from a team, what I think a team can do, and ultimately what a team has done, has actually just sort of put down on the stat sheet. And, you can't justify, for example, and I've had some people say, well, should Maryland be ranked? Should Maryland not be ranked? Maryland's is 9-2, Kentucky's 7-2, and Maryland's got a better win against Penn State, and their losses are better, frankly, too. And so you just sort of say, how can you justify ranking Kentucky, in front of, I don't know, Syracuse, which has the same record but has better losses and better wins? How can you justify that? I mean, I think I may have had Indiana higher than a lot of people this week. I had him either 17th or 18th, but it's like, listen, I don't think Indiana's a perfect team. And obviously the Duke win or the Duke loss is going to stick in a lot of people's minds. But how many teams out there have 4 KenPom top 50 wins right now and have played 3 true road games already this season? And it gets a lot easier in my mind, the rankings, once conference play hits, because you're seeing consistent competition at the level that you can judge most of these teams on, other than maybe the big time mid majors like your Nevadas and your Gonzagas. But until then, it is always going to be a blend of what you see, what you know, and what you think. And at a certain point for me, I'm not trying to make some moral stand. And certainly not to the degree that like Graham did, in terms of saying, well, if you don't play true road games, I'm just not going to rank you until you do. And that's Graham's prerogative. And I have no problem with it. I wouldn't do it, but I have no problem with it. But for me, you at least have to put something down on paper. And as good, for example, as I think Kentucky can be this season with the talent that it has, that there's just, Kentucky hasn't beaten anybody. And until they do, I can't, in good conscience, say I think they deserve to be one of the top 25 teams in the country. And I know I'm using Kentucky as the example here. I don't necessarily mean to make this answer all about Kentucky. I'm just using them because they're kind of a good case study into, to my mind, by this point in the season, the way I'm looking at my ballot.
That example actually works great for this audience, so we appreciate it.
Yeah, that's true too. But I'm not trying to sort of turn this into an Indiana Kentucky thing. It's just, that's just kind of the way I see it. And I probably I think I left Kentucky up higher in my ballot early in the season than a lot of other people did. I think, and I'm not positive about that, but I think some other people started dropping Kentucky sooner than I did, or more than I did. But just, it's at a certain point in my mind, you have to beat somebody. And if your best win on December 12th is UNC Greensboro at home, I don't really think that, I think it's unlikely you're going to have the profile of a top 25 team.
You mentioned your ballot becoming easier when conference play starts. Well, the Big Ten's obviously already started conference play with 2 games. And I think right now it's safe to say that Michigan is the class of the league overall, just based on their resume and where they rank defensively. But where do you kind of see Indiana at this point? I mean, obviously they're in the standings, they're 2-0, but there's a lot of really good teams in the conference this year. And I think Joe Lunardi's bracketology that he had updated this week had 10 Big Ten teams in the field as of right now, which is crazy when you think about it. But where does Indiana kind of fall in the pecking order for you right now, just in terms of what you've seen through these first 2 conference games?
Yeah, I'm actually looking at where Indiana is. I think Indiana is actually the 7th highest rated Big Ten team in Kim Pomeroy's rankings, and they're 25th. So that gives you an idea of, just where Ken Pom and, some of the other computers probably similarly see Indiana. But the thing about the Big Ten is it feels like, at least early on, it's going to be almost a mirror opposite to last season. When the Big Ten was so weak that a team like Nebraska could go 13-5 in conference play and not get an NCAA tournament bid. And if I remember correctly, and I'd have to go back and look at what the committee said after Selection Sunday, but I think not even really be that close. Like, I think they were like a 3 seed in the NIT.
They were a 5 seed. They played a road game at Mississippi State.
Yeah, I mean, so it's just like they weren't even they were 8 games over 500 in an 18-game Big Ten league schedule, and they weren't even a top 4 seed in the NIT. That's remarkable. This season, you've got 8 Big Ten just using the Ken Pom again. You've got 8 Big Ten teams in the top 30. I think you've only got 2 right now outside the top 100. I think that's Illinois and Rutgers. They're 105 and 110. And in fact, they're also the only 2 outside the top 60. What's going to happen for not just Indiana, but the Big Ten this season is there's going to be tons of chances at quality wins. And there's also going to be very, very few chances at dangerous losses, at really disastrous losses. You look at Indiana, for example, they play Illinois and Rutgers twice, and that means they've still got 16 games in Big Ten play alone against 14 games left in Big Ten play alone against teams right now ranked in the KenPom top 60. So you're going to have the opportunity for, I think, some Big Ten teams, and Indiana could be one of those, where maybe they've only got 22, 23 wins on Selection Sunday, but when you actually look at the quality in their resume, they could be really good. We could see some Big Ten teams that are getting seeded higher than teams from, let's say, the Big 12 or the Pac-12, or the Pac-12's a disaster this season, it seems like, but that are going to have worse records and maybe win higher seeds because they've just played, a tougher schedule, a tougher season. I think that I'm not saying that Archie Miller could have seen all of this coming. I do think that Indiana's non-conference schedule, especially if they win against Butler on Saturday, will prove really good in this regard, because number one, it will have guaranteed Indiana is really well tested on the road by the time they get to Big Ten play. They'll have obviously played the Duke game, the Penn State game, and the Arkansas game by the time they have to go to Michigan on January 6th. That's their first road game after they resume Big Ten play. Number two, it's a non-conference schedule that has given them a lot of close games, and they've won most of those. The only one they lost so far anyway is Arkansas. And again, I know this sort of sounds like legislating after the fact, but I think it's worth pointing out that they lose that Arkansas game by 1 point. But literally, they got as close to winning that game as they possibly could without winning it. Rob Finney gets all the way to the rim on what under other circumstances could have been the last legitimate possession of the game. Then Deron Davis gets a free look at a tip in, and neither of them go down, so they lose. So I'm not saying that you can just say, oh, well, we might as well count that as a win. But I am saying I think that performance reflected well overall, especially at the point in the season where it came, on this team's ability to handle going on the road. And if you can handle Arkansas on the road, you can obviously handle Penn State on the road. You're going to be able to, you're not going to see a ton of road environments more, intimidating than Fayetteville, certainly not more intimidating than Durham in Big Ten play this season. And then the third thing is Indiana's already got a solid, because Indiana has scheduled a little bit tougher for itself. Indiana's already got a solid platform to build from in terms of NCAA tournament resume. And again, if they beat Butler, they're going to come out in November and December with 5 top 50 wins, including 1 on the road and 1 on a neutral floor. And so I think Indiana, I picked them third in the Big Ten in the preseason, under the belief that, again, they would be a different team in February and maybe even January than they were in November and December, because I thought this group would need some time to grow up. I think that this is actually a group for whom the unusual break between December 23rd and January 2nd, they don't play a single game. After December 22nd, they don't play again until January 3rd. I think that break could be really, really good for them in terms of kind of just having some time to reset and kind of build on what they've done, whether they win or lose Saturday in the non-conference. But then the other thing that really strikes me is, if this team is going to be able to hang its hat on winning close in some of the same ways that some of Archie Miller's Dayton teams did, it's going to see a lot of close games this season. And I think you could absolutely see a top 5, if not top 4 finish for Indiana in the Big Ten. And now what that looks like in terms of, conference record, I'm not sure, because again, I think that you're going to see a pretty tight conference. It may be one where Michigan's a couple games ahead of the mob for most of the season, but I think you'll see in general a pretty tight middle from about, let's say, 3, maybe even 2, all the way down to 9 or 10. But I think that Indiana is as well positioned as anybody that isn't Michigan right now, as long as they continue to get healthy, to really make a run at a strong Big Ten season because of the qualities that we've talked about.
Zach, let's close talking about recruiting. Obviously Archie Miller has done a terrific job in a short period of time on the recruiting trail. We're already seeing the fruits of it this season with Rob and Romeo, in-state guys taking on big early roles. And already for next season, for the 2019 class, commitments from and signatures from Trace Jackson Davis, from Armand Franklin. I saw you retweeted this. The Indiana account sent out a tweet that said, "Keeping Indiana's best at home," which Trace Jackson Davis retweeted and tagged Keon Brooks on. So kind of the next guy that we're all waiting to hear what he's going to do. Have you been surprised at how quickly Archie has been able to take Indiana from a program that really didn't seem to be in the conversation with a lot of the important in-state recruits to now being one that, could be on the verge of signing their third 5-star recruit in just 2 years?
I don't know. In one respect, sure, because understandably he didn't really recruit at this level at Dayton very much. In another, I've said a number of times that ultimately recruiting is not about what you can do up front when you're new and you have momentum and you have juice. It's whether or not you can sustain those relationships and those pipelines. And it was something I remember Chris Lemonis, Indiana's now former baseball coach, said to me one time, and it sounds so simple, but I think it really does matter. Is he said, I've always found that it's basic as it is. If you get a kid from a good program and he has a good experience in your program, you're a lot more likely to get the next good kid out of that program. And I know that sounds really basic, but sometimes it can be. Sometimes look, everybody's got good facilities now. Everybody's got money. Everybody's got, good staffs. The Big Ten Network has caused all boats to rise in football as well as basketball. You just don't get to be unique with your practice facility or, your renovated locker room. That stuff's great and it helps, but that's, Trace Jackson Davis isn't committing to Indiana because they have a cool new locker room. He's committing to Indiana because he believes in the vision of Archie Miller and his staff and where they're taking the program and where they can take his career. And it's about making sure that Romeo Langford has the right experience that then passes down to Trace Jackson Davis and maybe a Keon Brooks and that those guys feel like they have professional potential, if not maybe one and done. Then, Romeo seems like right now he's tracking toward one and done. We'll see if Trace or if he does commit to Indiana, Keon Brooks are one and done, or maybe they need a couple years in college. But if they have the kind of experience that says, we went to Indiana, they made us better, we had a good experience, we learned a lot, we grew, and we got better and more ready for an NBA opportunity. And then at the same time, it's also worth pointing out a guy like Armand Franklin comes in, and if he is a 3 or a 4 year player, has a really good 3 or 4 year experience and says, okay, I wasn't one of those guys that was seen as an elite pro prospect from the gun, but I came in, I got better working with this coaching staff. I got better working in this system and in this culture and in this environment. And it prepared me to have a better college career and maybe even a better shot at a professional career somewhere. It's whether or not you sustain that stuff. I think that most Indiana coaches, if they do it right, would be able to recruit well early in state because, again, you're selling something new. You're selling something different. You're selling something kind of exciting and, the opportunity maybe I'm thinking about Tom Crean's early sales pitch was come be a part of rebuilding this program and think about what it will mean for your legacy. Whatever you do after Indiana, think about what it will mean for your legacy at Indiana. And I think from Archie Miller's perspective, obviously he can't sell quite the same thing because it's not such a big program tear down and build back up, but it is still, he's got a new message. He's got something different, something fresh, something a little bit younger, more vibrant, more energetic, more enthusiastic, whatever. It's whether or not he's making sure those guys have the right experience that they go tell the next guy, yeah, come here. This is a good place for you. And so I think it's not necessarily super surprising to me that he's recruiting the way that he is. He's also between his time at Arizona and Ohio State, he's been around elite guys before. He's been around Evan Turner and guys like that before. But I think it's the question is, are we still having this same conversation in 3 or 4 years? And the whatever the Trace Jackson Davis, whatever kid in 7th grade in, Washington Township schools in Indianapolis right now is going to be Trace Jackson Davis in 5 years. Is that guy still seeing Indiana in the same way? And maybe the same way that, you think about Tom Izzo and his ability to cash in on, recruiting cachet in Michigan. And I know he's missed on some guys over the years, but he's also, Miles Bridges is a great example. Tom Izzo's been at Michigan State 2 decades. and he still got the recruiting clout to go to Miles Bridges and say, "You're a Michigan guy, come play for me," because that's what Michigan guys do. So I think it's, again, I don't know if it's super surprising now. I think it's a good sign. And then the next question is just how much can it be sustained?
Yeah. Follow him on Twitter at Zach Osterman. Read his work on the Indianapolis Star website. Zach, thank you as always for stopping by Podcast on the Brink. It's great getting your insight.
Thanks, Zach.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me as always.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.